Hello, this is Philosophical Rebellion. Today I'm going to talk about the history of Western culture and the Scientific Enlightenment, the history of religious tyranny, as well as the secular foundation of the United States Constitution. So to start off, I have this quote: "We are each free to believe what we want, and it's my view that the simplest explanation is there is no God. No one created our universe, and no one directs our fate. This leads me to a profound realization. There is probably no heaven and no afterlife either. We have this one life to appreciate the grand design of the universe, and for that I am extremely grateful." That's a quote from Stephen Hawking, one of the smartest physicists to have ever lived. And the very line he starts it with, "We are each free to believe what we want," has not always been true in Western civilization. For literally thousands of years, religious tyrants have enforced what people are allowed to believe onto the subjects under their control. And that's why the Scientific Enlightenment was such a monumental cultural change in Western civilization. Because people like Galileo were put under house arrest by the church for challenging the idea that the earth was the center of the universe. People were not free to believe what they wanted, and scientists were not free to assess nature and come to whatever conclusions they draw from their observations. Instead, beliefs were dictated to people from the church and from religious tyrants trying to enforce their beliefs on everybody else. So, within Western civilization, there have been competing ideologies at play. The ideology of religious tyrants trying to say that their holy book is the literal truth and nobody is allowed to challenge it, and we all must abide by what they believe, versus Enlightenment thinkers like Francis Bacon, John Stuart Mill, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And what happened in the beginning of the Scientific Enlightenment was people like Francis Bacon realized that competing religious ideologies were preventing much of the scientific community from just observing nature and coming to conclusions based on those observations. So he said that we need to drop our preconceived notions and start building a evidence-based, observation-based set of knowledge that is true for all people in all places. Then we need to use things like logic and critical thinking to come to accurate beliefs about the world around us. And in order to do that, he created something called the Baconian method, which later became the scientific method. So Francis Bacon is the main inspiration behind how modern science currently operates. But that wasn't enough, because people like Galileo were making observations about nature and challenging the dominant paradigms that religion was teaching, and he was imprisoned for it. So you can't just have science without freedom of thought. And that's something that people like John Stuart Mill were advocating for. He wrote that liberty in the domain of consciousness has two main characteristics: the freedom to engage with whatever information a person wants to engage with, whether it challenges their current religion or culture or way of life or reinforces it. They should be free to explore the world and intellectually challenge their own beliefs. And secondly, along with freedom of exploration, they have to have freedom of thought, meaning that with the information they acquire, they are allowed, without restriction, to come to whatever beliefs they may. So he argued that no authority should be able to censor the dissent from other people or prevent wider society from hearing a certain subset of views. And he created one of the central defining features of the Enlightenment: the harm principle, stating that the only reason society should legitimately interfere on the actions of individuals is to prevent them from harming others. So there was this chain of events in Western civilization, from Galileo being locked away for challenging the church's geocentric conception of the universe, to Francis Bacon advocating for new ways for scientists to come to the most well-informed, accurate beliefs possible, to John Stuart Mill advocating for freedom of thought. And what happened coming out of that Enlightenment was widespread loss of religious faith in Western societies. And that inspired Friedrich Nietzsche to say, "God is dead and we have killed him." What he meant is the scientific enlightenment removed our need for God to understand the universe. So people don't defer to God on a day-to-day basis and just put all of their trust and faith in their religion as much as they had before. People were putting their faith and energy and enthusiasm into science. People put their trust in empiricism. And religions were no longer free to kill anyone who challenged what they said. Western civilization protected freedom of thought. And because of all those factors, Western civilization was destroying our need for God and our dependence on organized religion. So we killed God. And one of the fundamental ways that happened was the ending of government-based religious tyranny. And the United States largely inspired that by being created as a non-religious, secular nation. Not only did the First Amendment protect freedom of religion and prohibit our government from adopting any one religion, the author of the Constitution specifically stated that the United States was being created as a secular nation to end the centuries of religious warfare that had dominated Europe. James Madison, the author of the Constitution, said, "The purpose of the separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries." So instead of allowing that to continue, the authors of the Constitution created a non-religious government and protected individual liberty. So going back to how I began this podcast with Stephen Hawking saying that there is no God and we are all free to believe what we want. That is the outcome of the Scientific Enlightenment. And that is the outcome of the battle in Western civilization for individual liberty. But right now, the people who are claiming to represent Western values don't stand for individual liberty and freedom of thought. Some of the main people who claim to represent Western values are actually Christian nationalists. And there is also a very strong racial component in this, where a lot of the people who claim to represent Western values really only just support people who look like them and have the color skin they deem worthy of respecting. So just like the historical battle in Western civilization between religious tyrants versus people representing Enlightenment values, we still have that today. And I only support the Western values of the Scientific Enlightenment, not of the religious tyrants. When I talk about Western values, I'm talking about individual liberty, secular governments, things like universal human rights. I'm an atheist. I do not believe there is any God, afterlife, or designer of the universe. But that doesn't mean I want everybody around me to be compelled to live according to my beliefs. I would like to convince them in a free marketplace of ideas, like what John F. Kennedy was talking about, when he said, "We are not afraid to entrust the American people with foreign thoughts, alien philosophies, or competitive values." And I believe in individual liberty. I don't want everyone to be compelled to live according to my own value system. Kind of like Ronald Reagan was saying. Government exists to protect us from each other. Where it has crossed the line is trying to protect us from ourselves. So when people are claiming to represent Western values and Western civilization, you really need to dig down into what they mean by it. And if you made it this far in my podcast, I want to leave you with a few quotes from Stephen Hawking. "We are just an average breed of monkeys on a minor planet of a very average star, but we can understand the universe, and that makes us something very special. For millions of years, mankind lived just like animals. Then something happened which unleashed the power of our imagination. We learned to talk, and we learned to listen. Speech has allowed the communication of ideas, enabling human beings to work together to build the impossible. Mankind's greatest achievements have come about by talking, and its greatest failures by not talking. It doesn't have to be like this. Our greatest hopes could become a reality in the future. With the technology at our disposal, the possibilities are unbounded. All we need to do is make sure we keep talking." There is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win because it works. Try to make sense of what you see and wonder about, and what makes the universe exist. Be curious, and however difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. It matters that you don't just give up.